Welcome to the series What Jesus Meant. Hello, I'm happy to introduce you to the series of biblical messages by Dr. Balsan Thampu titled What Jesus Meant. As the title suggests, here's an attempt to unveil the deeper dimensions of Jesus' teachings. But being a Christian is not a requirement for viewing them. Jesus is presented here as the light of the world and not as the icon of a religion. Balsan is a voice heard with attention as a teacher, thinker, author, and preacher in Christian and secular contexts in India for over 4 decades. He teaches as one excited about the contemporary relevance of Jesus' spiritual vision. Through these video messages, he offers the fragrance of a fresh understanding of what it means to be Christian. This is a study series without academic rigors. For best results, viewers need to pursue the trail of thought to the end as a learning and unlearning experience. We hope you enjoy.
A warm welcome to everyone to the series of messages focused on what Jesus meant. This is an attempt to share with everyone who might be interested the deeper, truer meanings in the teachings of Jesus. Our focus today is on the idea of bondage, Jesus' idea of bondage in which human beings exist all over the world. I share these thoughts with you from within a very powerful experiential background, which I need to mark at the outset. In 2007, I became the principal of St. Stephen's College, which is easily the most sought-after college in India. Among 39,000 colleges, this is the most popular college in India. And when I accepted the invitation to be in charge of the institution, I did so because of my sense of mission, and I just wanted to see if Christian ideals could be practiced in the domain of higher education. In other words, I wanted to test and ascertain for myself the extent to which I, as a Christian, would be free to follow the ideals and teachings of Jesus Christ in the domain of my service. And it was a shocking realization as to how difficult it is to follow the teachings of Jesus Christ. That's number one. Number two, how exciting and fulfilling it is to abide by the teachings of Jesus Christ against tremendous odds, even at risk to one's own life. And how incomparable that experience is as compared to all other experiences of success, triumph, and personal profit in the world. So, I speak as one who has experienced the extent to which human bondage prevails, especially in the higher realms of service. I emphasize this because there is this assumption that only people in the lower segments of the society are unfree, which is simply not true. When it comes to following noble ideals and living by universal values, the higher you go on the official as well as social ladder, the more unfree you become. And therefore, there is a touch of personal intimacy or experiential intimacy to what I'm going to share with you. And I submit these insights derived entirely from the teachings of Jesus Christ, but tested out in the crucible of actual experience in a context that is highly contested, namely higher education in India. Now, as already stated, and as is quite well known, leading people out of their bondage into a state of freedom, constructive spiritually illumined, godly freedom is the quintessence of Jesus' ministry. And therefore, it stands to reason to assume that Jesus has a very clear idea of the nature and extent of human bondage. The inspiration or the motivation to liberate people arises out of the anguish one experiences regarding the unfreedom in which human beings languish in the world. So, put very simply, and I'm deriving this sort of working definition of bondage from the teachings of Jesus Christ. Put very simply, bondage is a state in which one is controlled by forces external to oneself and is therefore denied the freedom to be true to oneself, true to the divine intention behind every person's existence in this world. So this is the state that Jesus addresses, and it is a state from which Jesus delivers people. Therefore, let's very briefly examine some of the aspects of the state of bondage. Time will not permit us to undertake an exhaustive examination of the various facets of human slavery, human bondage. I'll just take a few representative aspects. Why is it that human beings languish in bondage? Why is it that they are not able to exercise their God-given freedom to the full extent, to the proper effect? The first reason for this, and this is from the teachings of Jesus Christ, is that human beings, without exception, live in a state of self-alienation. Now, at the simplest level, what it means is that we do not understand ourselves. How can we be free, or how can we exercise the freedom God has given to us if we do not understand ourselves? For example, if you were to really look back and ask, how did I choose my career? With what consideration, with what purpose, and to what goal? You would be surprised to note that even though you believe yourself to be a sincere Christian, your Christian vocation has had nothing to do with the choice of career. Rather, you chose your career going entirely by worldly considerations and standards and expectations, because the fact of the matter is that the worldly pressures operate very subtly within ourselves in the deeper levels of our psyche. And therefore, when it comes to making important choices in our life, we do not seek the will of God for us. We go entirely by worldly considerations and expectations. Or ask this question: how do you choose your lifestyle? Now, lifestyle is an important question in biblical spirituality. If you think of the story of Lazarus and the rich man, the rich man damned himself, or the rich man perished eternally because of the lifestyle that he maintained, and his lifestyle is vividly, though briefly, described in that text. This is the Gospel of Luke, chapter 16. Or think of the rich young man. He was a prisoner of the lifestyle that he maintained. And I'm sure this goes for all of us. And therefore, we must realize that the lifestyle that we choose for ourselves does not permit us to be the children of God. Because if we are children of God, as Jesus says in Matthew chapter 4, verse 4, we cannot live by bread alone. We cannot live by physical comfort and the sense of privilege that material affluence affords. So it's very obvious that the lifestyle that we maintain becomes a de facto prison for us. It compromises our freedom to a very serious extent. So again, ask ourselves, which part of our life is shaped by our relationship to God? Are we free to be children of God? If we are, in which aspect, in which respect of our life? Or ask a related question: what is the role that faith plays in my life? Clearly, if you're familiar with the teachings of Jesus Christ, even literally, you will find that there is a direct connection between spiritual freedom and faith. The primary function of faith is to enlarge the scope of human freedom, as well as to empower the human will in a godly manner to exercise that freedom in a constructive manner. So, there is a clear discontinuity between what we say by way of creedal affirmation and the way we actually live. Our life, or rather our existence, is marked by bondage, whereas our profession of faith is presumably predicated on freedom. And this is a kind of contradiction that we live. So the first problem the first sort of ingredient of our bondage is that we live alienated from ourselves. We do not understand ourselves. We certainly do not understand our identity as children of God, or we do not even bother to find out what it means and how it needs to be expressed. This is the first part of the problem. The second part of the problem is something related to this, what I call the conformity principle. We live in conformity to the pattern of the world, and clearly it's very obvious. Conformity is a pattern of slavery, not of freedom. You don't need any freedom to conform. For example, a new fashion comes in the market. You immediately go and buy that, and you sort of drape yourself in the new fashion. That doesn't need any freedom. It's actually a state of bondage. Or most people live by milking the status quo, that is, taking advantage of the status quo. That doesn't need any freedom. It only needs the skill to conform cleverly to the existing state of affairs. But when you do that, when you merely conform to the status quo, what happens is your life gets gradually filled with disenchantment and frustrations. But then you do not know what to do about it. So what you do is you grow sadly resigned to it. Now, such a case, of course, is found in the life of Nicodemus, who comes to meet with Jesus. Obviously, disenchantment with his position as the leader of the Jews in their religious life, or disenchantment with the Jewish religious establishment, was gradually growing and mounting in him. Otherwise, he would not have come to meet with Jesus, putting up with the embarrassment it entailed for him. That's the reason why he comes at night. He comes because he realizes that in his religious life he is in bondage. He's not able to express his true nature, and he feels progressively disenchanted. So this is a reality that is universal. I have not come across, to this day, even a handful of people who experience a sense of freedom, genuine spiritual freedom in the practice of their religion. Whether it is Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, whatever. Religion is a domain of conformity, of enforced conformity, and individuals conform to these practices and traditions not because they're convinced about it, and therefore they're not conforming to these prescriptions with their heart and soul in it. They're doing so out of compulsion, in a kind of grudging, mechanical fashion, and therefore the idea of religious freedom is a very dubious category, and this is something that Jesus invites us, in fact challenges us to realize. And when he talks about and denounces the priests of the times, and this is the main charge he levels against them, that that they consign believers to a state of religious slavery or religious bondage. Now, even our religiosity, therefore, undermines our freedom to follow Jesus. Now, every church has got its own traditions, and these traditions have superseded loyalty to Jesus Christ. And therefore, if you try to interpret the teachings of Jesus Christ in their truth and in their spirit, and if you try to follow them, you'll get into serious trouble with denominational churches, in fact, all churches, because, as Dostoevsky clearly indicates, and he is someone who understood this aspect very clearly in that amazing short story titled The Grand Inquisitor. The one crime that the organized church will not forgive, the one offense that the organized church will not put up with, is the crime of being faithful to Jesus Christ. It's a very thought-provoking experience to read that short story by Fyodor Dostoevsky. It's titled The Grand Inquisitor. So, why did Jesus not conform to the religious norms, rituals, practices, and authorities of the times? Jesus set very little store by the dogmas and rituals of Judaism. That's because he found that following them or abiding by them ran counter to his freedom to follow the will of his Father. What does Jesus say about his commitment? He says, I've come into this world only for one thing, and that is to fulfill my Father's will. And he says, therefore, doing my Father's will is food and drink for me. Now that's actually the mark of a child of God. But the freedom to do so will not be available in any religion, in any church whatsoever. So, there are of course other aspects to human bondage. We are in bondage in every aspect of life: social, political, economical, religious, cultural, whatever. Even in our family life, we are in bondage. Now let's consider Jesus' roadmap to freedom. This being the state in which human beings are. And what is that state? The state in which we are not free to be true to ourselves. We are not free to seek and understand God's purpose that underlies our coming into this world, God's expectations upon each one of us, God's will for us. We are not free to know and do the will of God concerning us. That is the ultimate form of unfreedom. It is out of this state that Jesus wants to lead us into the freedom and fulfillment of abiding by God's will for us. So, what is Jesus' roadmap for human freedom? Jesus begins by saying the first principle in the teaching of Jesus Christ is know yourself. Please understand who you are. And Jesus has put it as clearly as we can imagine. You are a child of God, period. If you are a child of God, please understand what it means to live as a child of God. If you are a child of God, clearly you can't exist enslaved, because God is pure freedom. As a child of God, you not only have a need to or a right to, you have an obligation to live in pure freedom. You have an obligation to protect yourself from the enslaving forces and influences of the world. Ultimately, your life belongs to God, and it has to be so lived upon this earth that it can be handed over as per the model Jesus Christ has given us on the cross of Calvary. It can be handed over in love, in faithfulness, in celebration to God the Father. So, first of all, the starting point of our journey to freedom is that we recognize our true identity, which is that we are the children of God. And if children of God, we cannot exist in bondage. We are obliged to be free. The second principle is the strategy that Jesus followed, namely, or the second principle in the roadmap to freedom is opening our eyes. Open your eyes. You might think that I'm being, a bit strange or queer in my head to say this. After all, we have got very powerful eyes. But what is it that we see? Now, seeing is a very, very important thing, or the kind of sight or vision. The correct word in the spiritual context is vision. The importance of that vision is consistently emphasized by Jesus. So when he identifies the essence of his public ministry, he says, I've come to open the eyes of the blind. That's a universal statement. Therefore, it means that every human being is spiritually blind. So it is that kind of blindness that we are thinking, we have as the point of reference. Now, the basic principle is this: what we see, as well as what we dare not see, decide the scope of our freedom. Now, a word about seeing. I don't know whether it occurs to you that seeing is the means by which we travel and connect. For example, at night you stand out and look at the sun, look at the sky. You see the stars. What does it mean? It means that you have already traveled to the stars. How did you travel? By means of your eyes. Each time you are seeing somebody, you are traveling to that object of sight. You are seeing somebody, you are actually traveling to that person. Nowadays, there is a law that prohibits gazing at women. Gazing at women. Why? Because, I don't know if the formulators of the law understood this. The philosophical principle is this: when you gaze at a woman, you are not just seeing her as in a kind of usual way, you're actually being with her in an intrusive manner. So to see is to be with. Now, there are certain things that the world allows you to see, and there are certain other things the world will not allow you to see, not in a kind of police law and order keeping fashion. Nobody will hold a gun to your temple and say, don't see this. Or to make this clearer, consider the parable of the sheep and the goats. There are two categories of people: people who saw and people who did not see. People who saw what? People who saw the needs of fellow human beings. And people who did not see. Nobody prevented them from seeing the needs of human beings and responding to them. Yet they were not free. That unfreedom stems from their own self. So there is this principle of unfreedom embedded deeply in our nature. For example, our selfish nature, which prevents us from seeing the needs of others and responding to them to the extent that we can. So that is a measure of the bondage in which we exist. Consider the parable of the Good Samaritan. The priest saw a man lying and bleeding on the roadside. He saw, but he did not see. He turned his face away and he walked away. So he's not free to see what he sees. And that's the strange thing about us, about which we are completely unaware. This is happening all the time. People have no eyes to see what they need to see, which also means that they have very sharp eyes to see what they want to see. A clear example is that of the high priest, Caiaphas, for example. He has a very sharp eye to see what is profitable for himself. He has a very sharp eye to see that the growing ministry of Jesus Christ could be a threat to his monopoly over the Jewish community. So, it is not that we are unable to see, it is that we are free only to see what profits or helps us or is convenient to us or is to our advantage. Spiritual freedom involves the freedom to go beyond this and to see what is necessary to meet the needs of others. That is spiritual sight. And that's the main point Jesus makes through this universally popular parable of the Good Samaritan. The third principle of freedom, or the third aspect of the roadmap to freedom that Jesus presents, is liberation from fear. It's incredible how our multiple irrational, baseless fears based not on any factual experience, how this host of fears undermine our freedom and actually reduce it to nothing. Most people do not attempt anything significant in their life because they fear the consequences. You see, if you lead a mere routine hand to mouth existence, you don't have to fear consequences. There's no consequence to your eating a sound breakfast or eating profoundly at night or, taking care of your backyard. But if you undertake a significant piece of action in the public domain, the significance of which will go beyond you and involve the welfare of others, then pockets of vested interest will become insecure and they will react very severely. And there will be brutal reprisals. And you fear that. But my experience, since I've tried this out on many, many occasions, if time had permitted, I would have narrated many of my experiences. But let me stay focused on the teachings of Jesus Christ. From my personal experience, I can vouchsafe this much. Many of our apprehensions in advance are ill-founded. In fact, as we take the step in faith, God's faithfulness begins to be operative in our life. God's justice begins to fortify our existence. I have been in situations on at least half a dozen occasions when my life was under threat. And from each of those situations, God miraculously saved me. I don't say this as a matter of pride. I say this as a matter of humble acknowledgement that if we trust God, God will redeem His promise that His grace is sufficient unto us. But then, you will not enter into these risky situations just because you believe that you will come out of it unscathed. In fact, you will enter them only if you are willing to accept the fact that if it be the will of God that you should give your life to that cause, so be it. That's the idea of abandoning oneself in faith into the hands of God. When you do that, how things work out is really exciting, remarkable, unforgettable. So, the self we must recognize, the self that is now redeemed by the love of God under the authority of Jesus Christ, is a crucible of fear. Or as an English poet, T.S. Eliot says, "Son of man, you are only fear in a handful of dust." Fear in a handful of dust. And therefore, Jesus addresses this reality of human fear and says, "Fear not, fear not, fear not." Now, actually, if you look at the fears that we entertain, we realize that there is something illogical about it. After all, what is it that you fear? You are fearing what is likely to happen. How do you know what is likely to happen? After all, that is hidden in the future. You cannot know what's going to happen the next moment. Then how do you know what is going to happen 5 days, 5 weeks, 5 months, 5 years from now? There's absolutely no basis. So, most people in the world feel held back, pulled back from doing what they know they should be doing because they fear the consequences, and that keeps them in a state of bondage. The fourth and the final principle that I may refer or mention in this context here is that is how Jesus leads us out of bondage into freedom, or Jesus' roadmap for our freedom is making us partners with Him in His mission. Now let me explain the principle underlying this. Mission, most people may not realize this. Mission is God's strategy for our own development. Unfortunately, mission is understood as charity done for the sake of somebody else out of the sympathy that we feel for them. That's not what it is at all. Mission is God's strategy for my growth and development, your growth and development. There is no other way to the development of your full potential. And it is God's mercy that you are not abandoned to work alone, but you are invited into a partnership with someone who is sufficient for you. And therefore, when we are in partnership with Jesus Christ and live a life of mission, which is a life of faith, then what happens is we enter progressively into this most amazing miracle of our growing into the fullness of our life, fullness of our personality, fullness of our potentialities and possibilities, which then generates a universe of happiness and fulfillment. There is nothing in the world that compares to this. Unfortunately, most people live and die robbed of this blissful state simply because they want to live for themselves within that narrow little elbows room for themselves. And therefore, they never really experience who they are and the amazing destiny that God had in mind for them. Now, therefore, to be underdeveloped is to exist in bondage. In fact, human freedom can be equated with human development. In fact, that's a literal meaning of the word development. It's a word of French origin. Like in the case of envelope, de-envelope, that is, to envelope is to cover from all four sides, and therefore you are in bondage. De-envelope is to remove those covers, and therefore you are now not in bondage. De-envelopment is development. So even economists may not remember this. The goal of development must be to set people free, to liberate people from poverty, from disability, from destitution, from misery. Unfortunately, the outcome of modern development is that millions and millions more of people sink into misery, destitution, and unfreedom. And that's the ungodly model of developmentalism. So, therefore, in the light of what we have examined so far, let's ask ourselves 2 or 3 very basic questions, and on that I'll close. First of all, let's ask ourselves a very, very simple question. In which aspect of our life, in which sphere of our life do we feel really free? Have we really experienced freedom beyond our childhood? When you're a child, you are free. So when Jesus said, truly, truly, I say to you, unless you turn back and become like children, you shall in no wise enter the kingdom of God. I believe that Jesus is also reminding us of our duty to be free, whereas now we voluntarily exist in a scheme of things where we are in bondage. So when is it that you last time really felt that you are exercising your freedom? When is it that you've experienced the exhilaration of being truly free in politics, in religion, in your professional work, in your relationships? Paul says, do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. He's, of course, referring to matrimonial relationships. Now, look at the metaphor, yoke. Do not be unequally yoked. But the thing is, Paul should have been a little more explicit and unambiguous here. The point is this: human relationships should not be referred to through the metaphor of yoke, except when interpersonal relationships become a sort of prison for both parties. Whereas God's idea of relationship is clearly indicated right at the beginning of the Bible, the book of Genesis, chapter 2, verse 18, God looks at Adam and says, it's not good that man be alone. Therefore, relationship should be a medium of freedom. But because of human selfishness, self-centeredness, because of the unregenerate human nature that seeks to degrade everything into tools for one's convenience, and therefore ends up insulting, degrading, wounding the other in interpersonal relationships. Relationships have come to be perceived as a kind of bondage, yoke. Of course, as you say, you would immediately shoot back and tell me, doesn't Jesus use that metaphor, take my yoke upon you? I'll come to that presently. But most people experience relationship as this kind of an arrangement of bondage, simply because they are not capable of relating to each other in the kind of freedom that God envisaged for them. People who relate to each other in a state of personal bondage to their own selfishness and therefore cannot enter into the joyfulness of a free, spiritually illumined godly relationship, will experience their interpersonal relationship as a state of slavery or bondage, oppression, resentment. But now coming to Jesus' use of the metaphor, the thing is, when Jesus says, "Take my yoke upon you," what he means is, what is his yoke? His yoke is a metaphor of his partnership with God, which is a partnership of pure freedom. Have you ever seen Jesus feeling forced in any respect in anything that he did during his public ministry? Any context? No. On the other hand, Jesus exudes freedom. That is the spiritual yoke. Here, yoke actually means being one with in a dynamic, missional manner. But in interpersonal context, when we use this idea of yoke, it has an entirely different meaning. It means it actually connotes what I already suggested. I don't want to repeat myself. So, when is it that you have experienced this freedom? As I said, in politics, in culture, in religion, in your professional work, in your interpersonal relationships, in your family context, in your church life. When? So it's a very serious matter. Secondly, ask this question: what is the role that fear plays in your life, in making choices, in venturing upon activities, in deciding what to do, what not to do, where to go, where not to go, what to stand for, what not to stand for? What is the extent to which fear dominates your life? As long as fear holds us hostage, we cannot be free. We are not free. Now the third question, on which I shall perhaps close: am I mindful of my duty to be a child of God? Now I have to say something about being a child of God. Who is a child of God? It's very simple. A child of God is one who expresses the nature of God through his life. What is the nature of God? Very clear. The Bible presents God, Jesus presents Jesus, God, in terms of 4 spiritual values, the attributes of God. We have not seen, we have not experienced God. We have experienced God only through Jesus Christ. And therefore, if you really regard the life of Jesus Christ and how he revealed God the Father, you will certainly come to this conclusion that Jesus revealed God, made God perceptible to us by revealing the basic attributes of the nature of God. These attributes are love, truth, justice, compassion. God is love, and therefore human beings have to love. That's why loving is a commandment. I have explained this in another message, therefore no further explanations. God is justice. God is truth. And therefore Jesus came as the truth of God's love. And therefore he introduces himself as the truth and commands us to enter the discipline of truth, and says that if the Son of Man makes you free, you will be free indeed. And the Son of Man is truth. And therefore Jesus invites us to enter into the truth, into the freedom that truth affords. God is justice. That's why Jesus says, seek first the kingdom of God and his justice. Jesus says, thirst and hunger after God's justice. Jesus is the incarnation of God's justice for the whole of humankind. And therefore, we must be free to follow and implement or uphold God's justice upon this earth. And therefore, when Jesus teaches that we should love the poor, blessed are the poor, or Jesus saying, I've come to preach the good news to the poor, the implication is very clear. He has come to establish God's justice on the earth, because man's justice knows how to take care of the rich. The one thing that man's justice cannot do is to do justice to the poor, and therefore doing justice to the poor is the priority in Jesus' idea of revealing God the Father. And then, of course, compassion. I don't have to explain this in detail. The entire life of Jesus Christ is a continuous expression of God's compassion in this world. Human beings have lost the capacity for love, for truth, for justice, for compassion. And to the extent that we have lost these fundamental values, and every value is an aspect of human freedom. This needs to be emphasized, particularly with young people. There are many people who think that being committed to values compromises one's freedom. It's exactly the opposite. You cannot be free unless and until you are firmly and resolutely committed to these values, because they are the markers, they are the foundations, they are the cornerstones of human freedom. So, as a child of God, it's our duty to reveal the nature of God and these attributes that I have briefly mentioned. In that light, please ask, what is the extent of freedom that we experience? In order to reveal the nature of God in these respects, love, justice, truth, compassion, in our day-to-day life and activities. Are we not scared, mortally scared, to practice these things and to uphold them, particularly in situations of oppression? Today, of course, we are living in an age of politics of post-truth, where truth has been systematically rejected. As a consequence, justice is proving a chimera. Compassion, well springs of compassion, is drying up. And there is no love available or visible in the world. So in such a context, human beings are in danger of losing their freedom completely. That's the reason why, my friends, dictatorship is rising all over the world out of the very stuff of democracy. In fact, the great contradiction, the nightmare that we are witnessing today is the dictatorships are emerging out of the very stuff of democracy. As one of my favorite authors, Arthur Koestler, writes about the rise of Nazi tyranny in Germany. He says, Hitler used perfectly democratic methods to butcher democracy. These are words worth remembering. Hitler used perfectly legitimate democratic means to murder democracy. That is what we are witnessing globally today. What's the reason for it? The reason is human beings have renounced freedom. They're happy to embrace slavery. After all, in democracy, you have the freedom to choose the kind of government, right? What's the government we choose? We choose governments that would oppress us. We prefer dictatorships. We prefer tyrants to democrats. We prefer brutal display of power to the experience of compassion and justice. We are inviting tyranny upon ourselves. We are today afraid of our freedom. And we need to now really look in the face, the horror of the degradation and the depravity that operate behind all of this. And so Jesus' ministry upon this earth embraces human nature in its totality. And it is therefore the light in which we need to read contemporary political historical events, so that Christians can truly become the salt of the earth and the light of the world. That light is much more needed today than ever before, for the darkness of human depravity is choking the earth today as never before. May God lead each one of us into a truer understanding of spiritual freedom, as well as imbue us the courage born of faith to practice that freedom to its full extent, so that we remain the light of the world. Thank you.